The rain had been a constant, rhythmic presence for 3 days straight, turning the backyard into a marsh and casting a persistent, gray gloom over the rooms of my new house. It was one of those old Victorian renovations where the previous owners had done a beautiful job on the surface, but the bones of the place still felt ancient and prone to shifting in the wind. I was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a third cup of lukewarm coffee and trying to focus on a spreadsheet that seemed increasingly meaningless as the afternoon light began to fail. My house is situated at the end of a long, gravel driveway, far enough from the main road that the only things I usually hear are the wind through the pines and the occasional deer moving through the brush. Being alone didn't usually bother me, as I've always preferred the quiet, but there is a specific kind of silence that settles into a house during a storm, a heavy sort of stillness that makes every small noise feel magnified. I found myself listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the floorboards upstairs, chalking it all up to the house adjusting to the drop in temperature. That was when I heard it for the first time, a sound so faint and high-pitched that I initially thought it was just the ringing in my ears from staring at a screen for too many hours. It was a single, metallic tink, like a silver spoon hitting a porcelain saucer, originating from somewhere deep within the ceiling. I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse, and waited for it to happen again. But the only sound was the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. I told myself it was probably a leak or perhaps a squirrel that had managed to find a dry spot in the eaves, though the sharpness of the sound didn't quite fit either explanation. I went back to my work, but the rhythm of my productivity had been broken, and I found myself straining to hear over the white noise of the weather. About 10 minutes later, the sound returned, but this time it wasn't just a single note. It was a sequence of 3 distinct, melodic tones that felt eerily familiar. It was the first few bars of a lullaby, the kind played by those small, upright toy pianos that were popular decades ago. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest because I knew exactly what was in the attic. A box of old toys I hadn't yet sorted through, including a miniature wooden piano that belonged to the previous owner's daughter. I tried to rationalize it by thinking that a heavy box might have shifted, or that the vibration from a particularly loud clap of thunder had caused the internal hammers to strike the strings. But there hadn't been any thunder for at least an hour, and the house was perfectly still, save for that delicate, intentional melody drifting down through the vents. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, a sound that felt unnecessarily loud in the oppressive quiet. I walked to the base of the attic stairs, my hand resting on the cold brass doorknob, and listened with an intensity that made my temples throb. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, and I began to feel a bit foolish for being spooked by a child's toy. Then, with a clarity that made my skin crawl, the piano played again, finishing the entire first verse of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with a slow, mechanical precision. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic sound of a toy falling over. It was the deliberate, rhythmic pressing of keys, spaced out exactly as the song intended. I told myself that I had to go up there, if only to prove to myself that there was a logical, physical explanation for what was happening. The attic stairs are the pull-down kind, and as I reached for the cord, I noticed how much colder the air felt in the hallway, as if the heating system had simply given up on this part of the house. I pulled the cord, and the wooden steps unfolded with a series of protests, sending a cloud of fine, gray dust swirling into the air. I climbed slowly, my phone's flashlight cutting a narrow, shaky beam through the darkness of the upper crawlspace. The attic was a graveyard of discarded memories, old suitcases, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and furniture covered in white sheets that looked like crouched figures in the periphery of my vision. I panned the light around until I saw it sitting on a low trunk in the corner, the small, red wooden piano, its lid slightly propped open. I approached it with a sense of profound dread, my boots crunching on the grit and insulation that littered the floor. When I finally stood over it, I saw that the keys were dusty and still, and there was no one else in the room, no open windows, and no obvious source of movement. I reached out a finger and pressed the middle C. The sound was identical to what I had heard from downstairs, a bright, lonely chime that echoed off the rafters. I checked the trunk it was sitting on, thinking maybe a mouse was trapped inside. But the box was empty except for a few old quilts and a heavy smell of cedar and mothballs. I laughed a little then, a dry, nervous sound, and decided that the house's foundation must be settling in a way that put pressure on the floorboards beneath the toy. I turned around to head back to the stairs, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as I moved away from the corner. I was halfway across the attic when the piano played again, but this time it wasn't a lullaby. It was a fast, discordant jumble of notes, as if someone had slammed their palms down on the keys. I spun around, my flashlight beam wildly sweeping the room, but the corner was empty, and the toy piano sat exactly where it had been. My heart was hammered against my ribs now, and I felt a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the chill in the air. I realized then that the sound hadn't come from the piano I was looking at. It had come from the dark, recessed area behind a stack of wardrobe boxes further back in the attic. I moved the light toward the boxes, and that's when I saw the second toy piano, a slightly larger one, tucked away in the shadows where the roof met the floor. Beside it, on the floor, was a small, half-eaten sandwich and a plastic bottle of water that hadn't been there when I moved in. My breath hitched as I realized that the settling sounds I had heard for weeks weren't the house at all, but the muffled movements of someone living in the crawlspace. I didn't see him at first because he was wearing a coat the same color as the insulation, huddled in the corner just inches away from where I had been standing. He was a man thin and gaunt, with eyes that caught the light of my phone like a cat's, wide and unblinking. He wasn't a ghost or a monster. He was a person, real and breathing, who had been watching me from the darkness while I ate my dinner and slept in my bed. He didn't move or speak. He just sat there with one hand resting on the keys of the second piano, his fingers long and dirty. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was just playing with the things he found to pass the time. I backed away, not taking my eyes off him, my boots catching on the edge of the attic opening as I stumbled toward the ladder. I didn't scream, because my throat felt like it had been filled with sand, and I scrambled down the steps as fast as I could. I pushed the attic door shut and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the wood. I called the police from the kitchen, my voice cracking as I tried to explain that there was a stranger living in my ceiling. They arrived 20 minutes later, their blue and red lights flashing against the wet pavement, and I stood out in the rain while they went inside. They searched the attic, the basement, and every closet, but when they came back out, their expressions were confused and slightly pitying. They found the sandwich, the water bottle, and the toy pianos, but the man was gone, having vanished through a small access panel that led out onto the roof. They told me they would patrol the area, but there wasn't much else they could do since no crime had been committed other than trespassing. I haven't gone back into the attic since that night, and I keep the dresser firmly wedged against the door. But sometimes, when the rain starts to fall and the house gets that heavy, expectant silence, I sit in the kitchen and listen. I don't hear the pianos anymore, but I do hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of fingers against the wood of the attic floor directly above my head. It's a slow, steady beat, like someone is counting the seconds until I finally fall asleep. I know he's still out there, or maybe he's still inside, finding a new corner of the house that I haven't thought to check yet. Every night, I check the locks and the windows, but I can't shake the feeling that the walls are thinner than they look. I sleep with the lights on now, but even the brightness can't drown out the sound of the house breathing. Sometimes I wonder if he's hungry, or if he's just waiting for me to leave so he can play his music in peace again. The worst part isn't the fear of what he might do, but the knowledge that he was there for months, watching me live my life in total ignorance. I can't look at the ceiling without imagining those wide, unblinking eyes staring back through the cracks in the plaster. I've put the house on the market, but in this economy, it might take a long time to sell. Until then, I just stay in the rooms with the most light and try not to listen to the shadows. But then, just last night, I found a single, small wooden piano key sitting on my pillow when I came back from brushing my teeth. It was dusty and smelled of cedar. A silent message left in the one place I thought I was safe. I didn't sleep at all, and I don't think I ever will again as long as I'm within these walls. The rain has stopped now, but the silence feels louder than the storm ever did. I'm just waiting for the next note to play, wondering which room it will come from this time. I've lived in this drafty, two-story Victorian for 3 years now, and I've become intimately familiar with every groan and sigh the old timber makes as the temperature drops at night. It's the kind of house that breathes with you, a cavernous space filled with original crown molding and floorboards that have been warped by a century of humid summers and freezing winters. Tonight, the rain is coming down in a steady, rhythmic pulse against the window panes of the kitchen, creating a gray veil that cuts me off from the rest of the neighborhood. I was standing at the counter, mindlessly stirring a cup of lukewarm tea and staring at the reflection of the stovetop clock, when I heard the first sound from the floor directly above me. It wasn't the usual settling of the house or the scurrying of a stray squirrel in the eaves, but a distinct, heavy thud that sounded like a boot hitting the wood. I froze for a second, my spoon hovering over the mug, and listened intently for a follow-up sound that never came. I told myself it was just the wind catching the attic vent, or maybe a heavy branch from the oak tree finally snapping under the weight of the rain. After a minute of silence, I convinced myself I was being paranoid, a side effect of working late and spending too many nights in this big house alone. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and decided it was time to head to the living room to finish the book I'd started earlier. As I took my first step away from the counter, a heavy, resonant creak echoed from the ceiling directly over my head. It was perfectly timed with my movement, a dull weight shifting on the floorboards of the master bedroom. I paused, my foot still half hovering over the linoleum, and the house fell back into its heavy, rainy silence. I took another step, a deliberate and slow stride toward the doorway, and the heavy footfall followed me with surgical precision. I stopped again, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I realized that the sound wasn't just random. I stood perfectly still for nearly 5 minutes, barely daring to breathe, watching the steam rise from my tea in the dim light of the oven hood. The silence was absolute, save for the rain, but the air felt charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I decided to test it, taking 3 quick, frantic steps toward the hallway, and 3 corresponding, heavy thuds boomed across the ceiling in a perfect mimicry of my pace. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Something or someone was up there, tracking my exact position through the floorboards. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I realized that the master bedroom should be empty, locked from the inside since I'd cleaned it earlier that afternoon. I reached out and gripped the edge of the hallway wall, my knuckles turning white as I tried to process the fact that I wasn't alone. I began to walk again, this time at a steady, rhythmic pace, and the footsteps above me matched me stride for stride, heavy and deliberate. They didn't sound like someone trying to be quiet. They sounded like someone who wanted me to know they were there, someone who was wearing heavy-soled work boots. Every time my left foot hit the floor, a corresponding bang came from the ceiling, and every time my right foot followed, the wood above me groaned under a significant weight. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up into the darkness of the second-floor landing, where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink. I didn't want to go up there, but the thought of staying in the kitchen while someone paced the floor above me was even more terrifying. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I keep in the hallway closet, its cold metal casing feeling small and inadequate in my trembling hand. I took the first step up the staircase, the wood beneath me shrieking, and an identical, heavy creak came from the hallway directly above the stairs. I took another step, and then another, the mirroring footsteps growing louder and more resonant as the distance between us closed. By the time I reached the midway point of the staircase, the footsteps were so synchronized with mine that it felt like an echo, a physical manifestation of my own movement. I stopped on the seventh step, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that felt like they were tearing at my throat. Above me, the footsteps stopped at the exact same moment, the weight of the person standing perfectly still on the other side of the ceiling. I could almost feel the pressure of their presence pressing down through the plaster and the lath, a suffocating, unseen force. I whispered a shaky hello into the dark, but the only response was the drumming of the rain and the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen below. I lunged up the remaining steps, clicking the flashlight on and swinging the beam across the empty hallway. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating the closed doors of the guest room, the bathroom, and finally, the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The hallway was empty, the air still and smelling of old dust, and the faint, sweet scent of my own laundry detergent. I walked toward the master bedroom door, my steps now frantic and uneven, and the heavy thuds above me ceased entirely. I realized with a jolt of pure, icy terror that the footsteps hadn't been on the second floor at all. They had sounded like they were above me when I was in the kitchen, but now that I was on the top floor, there was nothing above me but the crawl space and the roof. I stood in front of the master bedroom door, my hand shaking so violently I could barely find the handle. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming in the silence, and shone my light into the room where I expected to see a broken window or an open closet. The room was pristine, the bed made and the windows locked tight against the storm, exactly as I had left it. I turned around, intending to run back down the stairs and out into the rain, but I froze when I looked at the ceiling of the hallway. There, directly above where I had been standing just moments ago, were a series of damp, muddy boot prints on the white plaster. They weren't on the floor of the attic. They were on the ceiling of the hallway, as if someone had been walking upside down, defying gravity to stay directly over my head. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen as I realized the above I had been hearing wasn't a room, but the narrow, dark gap of the crawlspace right behind the drywall. The realization hit me that the person wasn't just matching my steps. They were positioned in the wall cavities and the ceiling joists, moving through the skeleton of the house. I heard a soft, wet sound, like a boot pulling out of thick mud, coming from the shadows of the ceiling directly behind me. I didn't turn around, I couldn't move. My muscles locked in a state of primal, paralyzing fear. I could smell it now, the scent of wet earth, old grease, and a sharp human musk that didn't belong in my home. A single drop of muddy water fell from the ceiling and landed on the toe of my sneaker, a dark stain spreading on the white fabric. I realized then that the footsteps hadn't been an echo or a game. They were a synchronization, a way for the intruder to hide their own noise beneath the sound of my life. The house was no longer my sanctuary, but a hollowed-out shell where someone else had been living in the spaces between the rooms. I felt a faint vibration in the floorboards beneath my feet, a subtle shifting of weight that didn't come from me. It was the sound of someone descending, not from the attic, but from a hidden panel I had never noticed in the hallway closet. The door to the closet, just 3 feet behind me, began to creak open with a slow, agonizing deliberation. I stared at the muddy prints on the ceiling, unable to look back, knowing that the person who had spent the last hour matching my every move was now standing in the same space as me. The rain outside seemed to double in intensity, a roar that drowned out everything but the sound of a heavy, wet boot hitting the hardwood floor directly behind my heels. There was no one in the rooms because they had been inside the house itself, a parasite in the architecture, waiting for the rhythm of my steps to guide them. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, smelling of copper and rain, and the realization that there was nowhere to run in a house that had been turned against me. I closed my eyes, the flashlight slipping from my numb fingers and clattering to the floor, the beam rolling to illuminate the muddy boots of a man who had no reason to be there. He didn't speak, he didn't growl. He simply took one more step, his foot landing perfectly in the space where mine had been a second before. The symmetry was complete, and I knew then that he wasn't just following me, he was becoming me. I am still standing here in the dark, the flashlight battery beginning to flicker and fade into a dull, dying orange. I can hear his breathing now, a heavy, wet rasp that matches the timing of my own panicked gasps. I want to scream, but I know that if I do, he will simply scream with me, his voice layering over mine until no one can tell us apart. The rain continues to hammer on the roof, a relentless noise that offers no comfort and no escape. I can feel his hand reaching out, not to grab me, but to mimic the way I'm holding my own chest in terror. The house is silent again, except for the twin sounds of two hearts beating in a frantic, terrifying unison. I don't know how long I can stay like this, a statue in my own hallway, while the man who walked on the ceiling waits for me to take the next step. And I know, with a certainty that shatters my mind, that when I finally do move, he will be right there to catch the sound. There is no help coming, because the neighbors only see one set of lights on and hear only one set of footsteps. I am a prisoner in a house of echoes, and the echo is finally stepping out of the shadows. I have lived in this house for nearly 3 years now, and I have always appreciated the way the old floorboards seem to sigh under my weight like a tired friend. It is a standard 2-story colonial tucked away at the very end of a cul-de-sac, the kind of place where the silence of the neighborhood usually feels like a protective layer rather than a threat. Tonight, I was sitting in my upstairs office, hunched over a laptop screen that served as the only real source of light in the entire room. The air conditioning had just cycled off, leaving the house in that heavy, pressurized stillness that makes you acutely aware of the sound of your own breathing. I could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator from all the way downstairs, a comforting mechanical pulse that grounded me in the reality of a mundane Tuesday night. I took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee, grimacing at the bitterness that had settled at the bottom of the mug. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms until my joints popped, and stared out into the dark hallway. That was when I heard the first sound, a sharp, singular crash that echoed up through the floorboards and made my heart stutter in my chest. It sounded exactly like someone had taken one of the heavy oak cabinet doors in the kitchen and slammed it shut with every ounce of their strength. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting for the sound of a voice or a footstep to follow the impact. The house, however, returned to its oppressive silence immediately, as if the sound had never happened at all. I told myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps a sudden shift in humidity had caused the wood to warp, and a door had finally latched itself. It was a logical, boring explanation, the kind you repeat to yourself when you are alone at 2:00 a.m. and do not want to admit your pulse is racing. I waited another 5 minutes, staring at the sliver of light coming from the hallway, watching for any shadow that shouldn't be there. Nothing moved, and the only other sound was the distant, muffled barking of a neighbor's dog 3 blocks away. I eventually turned back to my screen, though my focus was completely shattered, and I found myself staring at the same paragraph for what felt like an hour. My ears were ringing with the effort of listening for another anomaly, a tiny creak, or the brush of fabric against a wall. 10 minutes passed, and I was just starting to relax my shoulders when the sound happened again. But this time, it was not just one single slam. It was a rapid-fire succession of 3, maybe 4 cabinets being violently hammered shut in a rhythmic, aggressive pattern. Bam, bam. Asterisk, it was so loud and so physical that I actually felt the vibration travel through the legs of my chair and into my spine. For a split second, I was absolutely convinced that someone had smashed through the sliding glass doors and was systematically destroying my kitchen. I did not grab a weapon, because in that moment of pure, unadulterated panic, my brain simply ceased to function in any heroic capacity. I stood up and bolted for the stairs, my socks slipping slightly on the polished wood of the landing. I stopped halfway down the flight, gripping the banister so hard My knuckles turned white and began to ache. The kitchen was just around the corner from the bottom of the stairs, hidden from my current line of sight by a narrow coat closet. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of the garlic chicken I had cooked for dinner, a smell that now felt strangely sickly and out of place. I rounded the corner, my chest heaving with shallow breaths, fully expecting to see a scene of total chaos and destruction. I reached out and flipped the light switch, the overhead fluorescent bulbs flickering to life with a buzzing sound that grated on my nerves. To my absolute horror, the kitchen was perfectly, terrifyingly still. Every single cabinet door was flush against its frame, the handles aligned in their usual neat, orderly rows. The pantry door was clicked shut just as I had left it, and the dishwasher was still humming its quiet, mid-cycle song. I walked over to the kitchen island, my bare feet feeling the bite of the cold linoleum, and I reached out to touch the wood of the nearest cabinet. It was stone cold to the touch, showing no signs of the violent energy I had just heard echoing through the house. There wasn't a single mark on the white paint, no scuffs, no chips, and no dust disturbed on the counter beneath the hinges. I stood there for a very long time, listening to the clock on the wall tick away the seconds, feeling like a fool for being so terrified of a ghost sound. I decided to stay downstairs for a while, sitting at the small kitchen table with the lights on, convinced that a rational explanation would present itself. I thought about water hammers in the pipes, or perhaps a freak air pressure event in the ductwork that was creating a vacuum effect. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand trembling just enough to make the ice cubes clink against the glass. As I sat there, the silence of the house began to feel different, less like a vacuum and more like a held breath. I noticed something then that I had missed in my initial sweep of the room. On the polished surface of the kitchen island, right near the edge where the slamming would have been the loudest, there were 3 small, wet droplets. I leaned in closer, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs with renewed force, and realized they were not water at all. They were dark, thick, and looked remarkably like wet earth or mud that had been tracked in from outside. I looked up at the ceiling, thinking maybe there was a leak in the plumbing from the upstairs bathroom, but the plaster was bone dry. My eyes drifted back down to the lower cabinets, specifically the one beneath the sink where I keep the cleaning supplies. It was shifted just a fraction of an inch, creating a gap that was dark and deep, much wider than the others. I reached down, my fingers shaking violently, and gripped the silver handle to pull the cabinet door open to investigate. It wouldn't budge at first, resisting my pull as if something heavy was leaning against the other side of the wood. I pulled harder, a low, frustrated grunt escaping my throat, and suddenly the resistance gave way with a sickening, wet pop. The cabinet was empty of my usual sponges and sprays. Instead, the back panel had been neatly and professionally sawed out. I stared into the narrow, dark crawl space that ran behind the kitchen walls, a space I hadn't even known existed when I bought the house. I didn't see a face, but I saw the distinct, muddy print of a hand on the interior side of the cabinet door I was holding. The handprint was distorted, with fingers that were far too long and a palm that looked unnervingly narrow and elongated. A faint, rhythmic scratching began from inside the wall directly behind where I was kneeling, moving upward toward the ceiling. It was moving toward the office where I had been sitting only moments ago, a calculated, scraping sound of nails against dry wood. I backed away, tripping over a kitchen chair and crashing to the floor, my eyes fixed on the dark hole in the back of my cabinetry. I realized then that the slamming wasn't the sound of the doors closing from the outside. It was the sound of someone inside the wall, kicking the back of the cabinets to see how long it would take for me to come down. I didn't call the police right away because I was too busy watching the vent cover above the refrigerator. I saw a single, pale and dirt-stained finger poke through the metal grating, testing the strength of the screws. The scratching stopped, and a soft, wet whispering sound started to bleed out from the shadows of the pantry. It wasn't a language I recognized, just a series of sibilant clicks and low, guttural hums that felt like they were vibrating in my own skull. I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that they weren't trying to hide from me anymore. They were announcing their presence. I scrambled to my feet, not caring about the noise I was making, and ran for the front door. I didn't grab my keys or my shoes. I just threw the deadbolt back and sprinted out into the cool night air. I am riding this now from the front seat of my car, which I had left unlocked in the driveway, parked under the amber glow of the street lamp. I can see the kitchen light is still on, casting a long, distorted shadow against the blinds that looks like a person standing perfectly still. I haven't seen anyone leave the house, but I saw the front door, which I know I slammed behind me, slowly swing open again. It stayed open for a moment, an invitation into the dark, before clicking shut with that same violent, echoing bang. I am watching the upstairs office window now, and I can see a small, flickering light moving around inside, as if someone is looking for something I left behind. I know I have to call someone, but my phone is still sitting on the desk next to the laptop, right where I left it. The street is silent, the neighbors are all asleep, and the front door of my house just unlatched itself again, very slowly. I can see a shape beginning to emerge from the darkness of the hallway, stepping out into the porch light's reach. It isn't a ghost, and it isn't a monster. It is a man, wearing my old flannel shirt, and he is smiling directly at me. He hasn't moved from the porch. He just stands there, watching me in the car, waiting to see what I will do next. I realized then that he isn't trying to get out. He is waiting for me to realize that he has nowhere else to go. The kitchen cabinets start slamming again. Even from here I can hear them. A frantic, rhythmic drumming that won't stop. He doesn't flinch at the sound. He just keeps his eyes locked on mine, his fingers tapping against the doorframe in perfect time with the noise. I put the car in reverse, but my hands are shaking so hard I can barely grip the wheel. As I back out of the driveway, I see him lift a hand and wave. A slow, mocking gesture that tells me he knows I'll have to come back eventually. The house is still glowing with light, looking perfectly normal from the outside. A quiet colonial at the end of a quiet street, but I can still hear the cabinets. A dull, repetitive thudding that follows me all the way to the end of the block.